last time we talked about exoplanets, and before that we talked about all of the different objects in our solar system. So today we're going to talk about the possibility for finding life either in our own solar system or somewhere else out in the cosmos. So today is all about life in the universe. So we'll start. We have one place where we know life exists, so that's on the Earth. So we'll talk about what we know about biogenesis, or life starting on Earth, and what we need for that life to exist on the Earth. So here's a timeline of Earth's history, especially with regards to life. So the Earth is forming a bit more than 4 billion years ago. You have lots of early impacts, like for example the one that broke off enough material to form the moon. And so that very early period where a lot of stuff is hitting the Earth is not going to be conducive to life existing. A little, about 3.8 billion years ago, we have evidence for carbon isotopes that could be signs of life. So this is a carbon isotope that we really only see forming with life. And then a little later than that, we actually have fossil records of organisms. So we definitely know there was life in this region. But even after life has formed, it takes a really long time to build up the kind of oxygen in the atmosphere that we would need to support things like animals and eventually humans. So you can see in this kind of very recent era, we'll expand that out in the bottom here, and this is when we get really plants and animals evolving. So the Cambrian explosion has a lot of animal diversity. Eventually plants and fungi will colonize the land, and animals will follow. Then we have some periods of mass extinctions, like between the Permian and Triassic periods, and then after the dinosaurs go extinct. And during this period, mammals are living with the dinosaurs. Eventually the dinosaurs go extinct, and now mammals are the dominant species, and eventually humans evolve and we develop our societies. And there's evidence of life in carbon isotopes from 3.85 billion years ago. So almost as soon as the heavy bombardment period ended, life sprung up pretty quickly. So keep that in mind when we think about how easy or hard it is for life to form. One of the key ways that we study the formation of life and its history are by finding fossils. So first, those fossils are going to be deposited in various layers of sedimentary rock over time. And as each new layer is deposited, you basically have a history book that you can read through, where each layer is an older chapter of history. So the stuff doesn't always end up, say for example, on the seafloor, because we have plate tectonics, and so that material can be uplifted back up to places that are accessible for humans to go looking for fossils. And we can use carbon dating techniques, so the carbon isotope that we associate with life and other isotopes are not stable, so they decay, and using some physics we can figure out how old objects are by using radiocarbon dating. As an example of sedimentation over time, this is the Grand Canyon, and the Colorado River has cut through the canyon, revealing all these different layers of sedimentary rock, and those different layers correspond to different epochs of the Earth's history. And so if you find fossils in the different layers, you can reasonably tell how old those fossils are. The earliest fossils that we know of are from stromatolites. So this object is not really the organism itself. The organisms are bacteria, they're microscopic, but the byproducts of their life functions create these rocky structures that only form from these stromatolites. And you can use radiocarbon dating to determine how old these fossils are, and we found stromatolites that are 3.5 billion years old. And these organisms still exist on the Earth, so these are stromatolites that currently are living in Australia. On the picture on the left. And we don't just find microscopic life or single-celled life. There's multicellular fossils that are fairly old, and we also find certain carbon isotopes that are only produced by life, and for example, this one is dated to 3.95 billion years old. And so keep this idea in mind that you don't necessarily have to find a fossil that looks like a worm. You can instead find just deposits of carbon that are only produced by life functions. So that'll be very important in a few slides when we talk about life in the solar system. So how did we get life on Earth? This is still an open question, and this is one of those things where if you can figure it out and prove that this is how life worked, you get a Nobel Prize, and you go down as an Einstein type of scientist. So we know that there are the building blocks for life available in Earth's early environment. So carbon, nitrogen, those kinds of things. Then those molecules can combine to produce things like RNA. So this is still not life yet, but certain RNA that will multiply and reproduce, in quotation marks, are ones that will continue to survive, and eventually those RNA molecules that have high enough reproductive rates can continue to evolve and eventually form primitive cells, and then what we would call life in the form of a DNA-based cell. So this is not necessarily a process that happens instantly. It's going to take a long time. But luckily, the Earth has been around for billions of years, so we've had billions of years for this process to happen. We can trace all of the life on Earth to those first molecules that were reproducing and formed the first cells. And we may never know exactly what the first organism was, but people are doing experiments to try to recreate the conditions around on the early Earth to see what we can get to form in those conditions. So, for example, the Miller-Urey experiment shows you reproduce the conditions that were around in the early Earth. You watch what happens over time, and we haven't seen a cell form out of this process, but we have seen things like RNA or protein formation. And we can make kind of pre-cells ourselves in the lab using the conditions and materials that you have from the early universe, but we haven't so far created our own life from nothing, basically. And the way that life works on Earth and probably everywhere else in the universe is through the process of evolution. So this is a DNA molecule with different amino acid pairs. When you say in a cell, if you split, when you reproduce, you have to copy this DNA exactly to have the same organism that you have after the split. There can be random variations in this copying process that lead to mutations, and different mutations might be more or less beneficial than other mutations, and that leads to the process of natural selection. So whatever environment you have might favor one of those accidental copying mistakes, and so that organism will reproduce better and therefore become more abundant, and that's the process of natural selection. So, like I said, we can trace all of the life on Earth to this common ancestor, and then you have various branches forming for different types of organisms. So the kind of reddish and bluish branches are bacteria, and then the green branch are multicelled organisms. So that's things that you might be more familiar with, like animals, plants, and fungi. And so you can see where humans are just a very small part of this very large tree of life. And we can use genetics, studying DNA, to map all of this out and see what parts of DNA are similar between all of these different branches of life. So studying all the life that we have currently on the Earth, we think the earliest forms of life on Earth might resemble bacteria that we find today that thrive in these underwater vent volcano systems. And so we think life started in Earth's oceans before going out onto the land. And this is another thing to keep in the back of your mind when we talk about where we might find life elsewhere, especially in the solar system. Another theory for how life could have started on the Earth is related to the study of asteroids that we talked about a few lectures ago. So in that discussion, we said that we are routinely receiving material from other planets, and we're also, parts of the Earth are also being distributed to other planets through this process of asteroid impacts. And so it's possible that maybe life started on a Venus or a Mars first, and then that biologic material was deposited on the Earth later. So we have evidence for even animals that can survive the vacuum of space. So this is a tardigrade. This is a real picture of what it looks like under a microscope. Even though it looks really weird, that's a real animal. And so animals can survive in space. Microbes can certainly survive for much longer in space. So it's entirely possible that you don't find how life started on Earth because it actually started on a different planet and then was deposited on the Earth later. That's not really a satisfying answer to me, because then you just ask, well, how did it start on that other planet? So kind of the history of the Earth. 4.4 billion years ago, we have early oceans forming. Then 3.8 to 3.5 billion years ago, we have single-celled organisms, and especially cyanobacteria, which will start releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, which we're going to need for our multi-celled organisms to evolve. That takes a really long time to build up, so you're not really getting a lot of plants and animals developing until 2 billion years after the Earth is forming, or 2 billion years ago. Then the Cambrian explosion is when you get a lot of different species of animals evolving. 220 to 65 million years ago, you have the dinosaurs ruling. Then you have a big asteroid impact that causes the dinosaurs to go extinct, and that leaves the stage open for mammals to thrive. And then a few million years ago, you have the first hominids, which are our ancestors, but you're not getting humans until a few 100,000 years ago. So over the scale of the life of the Earth, humans have been around for a very small amount of time. So if we were to get in a time machine and hit the random button, and we ended up somewhere in Earth's history, what would be the most likely result? Yeah, so from the Earth forming to 2 billion years ago, there wouldn't have really been enough oxygen in the atmosphere for you to breathe comfortably. So that's the right choice. And we have to thank the cyanobacteria for releasing all that oxygen into the air using photosynthesis. So converting the sun's energy and whatever minerals you have in your environment to create oxygen and energy to support yourself. So what we know that life on Earth needs are a nutrient source, so you don't necessarily have all of the elements inside of your body to do your life processes, so you need to take those in from your environment. You need energy, whether that's from the sun or some kind of volcanic vent in the seafloor. You need liquid water, and we'll talk about why water is unique. And we need, these are the building blocks for our biology: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So when we're looking out into space, these are the things we're looking for when we talk about planets that we could find life on, or that we might be interested in colonizing in the future. So why is water unique? So the chemical properties of water, the first one is that it is a polar molecule, meaning that the hydrogen parts are more positively charged and the oxygen part is more negatively charged, and that allows you to dissolve things in a volume of water. So if we think about salt in the oceans, that salt is dissolved into the water because of this polar nature. Inside of your bodies, the polarity of water is also what lets you bring things from outside of your cell membrane and inside of your cell membrane. So if you're developing a biology that doesn't rely on water, you need some other kind of liquid that can do the same thing, and that's very tough to find. The other interesting thing on a more global scale is when water freezes, it actually becomes less dense. So when most liquids transfer from liquid to solid, they become more dense, and so they would sink. But if you have life living in a pond and ice was more dense than water, the ice would sink to the bottom and kill any living thing that was in that lake or ocean. So the fact that ice is floating on the water means that you can have life living in a frozen ocean or lake, and it actually might be warmer than the outside temperature because the layer of ice is insulating that environment. So again, keep this in mind when we're thinking about where we might find life in the solar system. So to review, the earliest evidence of life that we have is 3.85 billion years ago, shortly after big impacts from asteroids stopped hitting the Earth. And we might never know what the exact origin of life was on Earth, but we can track the evolution of life through studying genetics and find commonalities between all the life that we currently have on Earth. And we need nutrients, energy, liquid water, and carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen to support life, at least how it exists on Earth. So now that we have a better understanding of how life works on the Earth, let's try to find that in other places in our solar system. We've sent a lot of probes to Mars, and those probes have told us that there was liquid water sometime in the past on the surface of Mars, so that was one of the things we needed for life. There still may be, there still is subsurface ice on Mars, and so if there is a heat source nearby, maybe that could support current life. And so Spirit and Opportunity rovers found all of this evidence for liquid water being on the surface of Mars in the past. Curiosity is another rover that we've sent to Mars, looking for evidence of life on the surface. And Perseverance is the newest rover, and this is the most compelling evidence that we've found for life on Mars so far. So when we talked about Mars earlier, we had videos of a rover driving on the surface and then a helicopter flying. So that's this rover. And this is a 2025 Nature paper. They found evidence of iron phosphate and iron sulfide minerals that on Earth are produced by life, and they found this last year, and they've spent a whole year trying to come up with mechanisms to create these minerals that don't involve life, and they haven't found them so far, and so they published this paper about their findings. So the key for this is that you can get iron phosphate and iron sulfide forming inorganically, but that only happens at very high temperatures. And the rocks that they found these minerals in showed no evidence of that kind of temperature. So again, the only way we think that this happens is through life. So this might be it. This might be, we have found evidence for life on another planet. But scientists are very cautious in how they word things, and so that's why the title doesn't say life on Mars found. But you might look back 20 years from now, and this might be the thing where they say this was actually the first evidence that we found, and now we've built up a lot of supporting evidence to really show that this is life on another planet. So this might be a very impactful finding. So Mars, very exciting. Venus, much less exciting. It's way too hot on the surface to have any life like we have on Earth. There's not going to be any liquid water, but higher in the atmosphere, there is the right temperature for water. So if you can have some kind of organism that exists in the clouds on Venus, maybe you can find some very exotic life forms that we don't see on the Earth. But it's not just planets that we can look for life. There's a lot of moons that have interesting conditions that might be supportive of life. So Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto are Jupiter moons of Jupiter that we think might have subsurface oceans. And so life started in Earth's oceans, and so if these have liquid water oceans, all it would take is some kind of a hot vent in the bottom to produce the conditions that we regularly find life on Earth. And these planets all have this geologic activity because they have tidal heating from their orbits around Jupiter. And so also keep this in mind when we think about where life might exist outside of our solar system. Titan is one of Saturn's moons. It has a very thick atmosphere. So an atmosphere is something that can protect you from harmful things like cosmic rays. It's too cold for liquid water, but we do think there's liquid ethane and methane on the surface. Figure out a chemistry that, for example, can use ethane or methane to support life functions, then maybe you can try to find life or show that life could exist on a place like Titan. Enceladus is another one of Saturn's moons, and we actually see evidence for the kind of activity that we find in Earth's ocean. So this is an image of Enceladus, and this is it outgassing water, or water vapor. And so there has to be a reservoir of water, and it has to be hot enough that it is turned into a gas. And so there might be enough energy in Enceladus's interior for there to be some kind of pockets of life. So there's maybe evidence for past life on Mars. There's certainly evidence for there being liquid water on the surface. Venus's atmosphere could be some very exotic life forms you could try to theorize, but then some of the moons of the gas planets are very interesting because we think there's subsurface water. Okay, so we know the most about the Earth, and then we know a bit about the solar system. So let's try to apply that knowledge to what we might find around other stars. So we'll talk about what we mean when we talk about the habitability of a planet and what exoplanets might have life on them and how we would detect that life. So a habitable world is just one that has the basics that we need for life, like liquid water, energy source, nutrient source, and carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's life on it, just that life as we know it on Earth could exist there. And the things that we, from an astronomical point of view and geologic point of view, that we need to sustain life are proper distance from its host star. We think we need volcanism to make and maintain an atmosphere. Plate tectonics on the Earth are part of this, the carbon cycle that helps to regulate our atmosphere. And then you need a magnetic field to protect that atmosphere from the solar wind. Otherwise, it will get stripped away, and then you don't have an atmosphere to protect you. So the being in the habitable zone of a star just means you're far enough away from the star that the temperature on your surface is just right to have liquid water. And this the size of your habitable zone will scale with the size of your star. So a smaller star will have a closer in and smaller habitable zone than a larger star will have. So we haven't talked about stars yet in this class, but we'll get there in the next couple weeks. For the size of the planet, the bigger the planet, especially for a terrestrial planet, the better. So larger planets retain their heat from formation better, and so they have a better chance to have volcanism, plate tectonics, and a magnetic field to protect that atmosphere. When we look at the solar system, really the Earth is the only one that meets these conditions. So when we're looking at exoplanets, that could have life on them. We're looking for planets that are at least as large as the Earth or bigger. What kind of planets do we see around other stars? So we talked about exoplanets last lecture, and we think that there are lots of Earth and super Earth-sized objects. There's mini Neptunes, and then there's larger gas planets as well. So there's lots of potential places for us to look for life on other planets. The most likely would be Earth-like planets that are in the habitable zones of their stars, but we're not constrained to just looking for life like we see it on the Earth. So just like in our solar system, there could be moons around some of the gas planets that have a solid surface and therefore could support life. Then there are super Earths and water worlds. So these are super Earths, more massive terrestrial objects than Earth, and water worlds. So these are exoplanets that have the density of water. So maybe it's just a whole planet that's completely covered in an ocean. And if we have life forming in Earth's oceans, then these would also be very good candidates for where life might form. And then there's other more exotic places, like you could have life living underneath the surface of a planet or a moon. You could have orphan planets, so these are planets that have been ejected from their solar system. So they wouldn't have the star giving them energy anymore, but they could have some internal heating from the planet providing enough energy for life. So there's lots of places that we can and are looking for this life. Take a minute or two to think for yourself how we could detect life on exoplanets. So think about what we talked about when we were talking about exoplanets and what we can learn from them to try to answer this. So let's see what things scientists are looking for when we look for life on other planets. So we definitely do look at the chemical signatures of exoplanet atmospheres if we can get that data. So this is comparing Mars, Earth, and Venus. And so you can see on Venus and Mars there's very little CO2, but on the Earth there's quite a bit. So CO2 is not necessarily only produced by life, but if we find an exoplanet atmosphere that has an overabundance of CO2, then we would certainly call that a candidate, and we would invest a lot more resources into finding some more chemical signatures that might be more indicative of life on that planet. We can look for technosignatures, so these are evidence not just of life, but of intelligent life. So spacecraft are signs of astroengineering. So a Dyson sphere is this concept that so instead of just having solar panels on your planet absorbing sunlight, why don't we just wrap the whole star in solar panels and collect all of the sunlight? So if you ever see a star suddenly turn off and there was no supernova or gamma ray burst or anything, then maybe some civilization has put up a Dyson sphere, and that's why you can't see that star anymore. We could look for radio signals from space that don't seem to be natural in origin. Another thing you could look for in the atmosphere is maybe some kind of chemical that's a byproduct of some kind of industrial process. So maybe not a life process, but something that indicates something that life is making. So there's lots of things that scientists can and do look for. And the key candidates that we want to study have to be the right distance from their star, and they have to be big enough to have volcanism, plate tectonics, and a magnetic field that protects their atmosphere. And we're not just constrained to the surface of a planet going around a star. We can look at moons going around planets, or perhaps subsurface oceans, or so lots of possibilities to look for. So that brings us to not just searching for life, but extraterrestrial intelligence. So we'll talk about the Drake equation, which lets us calculate how many civilizations might exist in the galaxy. And then we'll talk about SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So this is a simplified version of the Drake equation. And this will allow you to calculate the number of civilizations that you could potentially communicate with. So the first thing you want to calculate are the number of habitable planets in the galaxy, then the fraction of those habitable planets that actually have life, the fraction of planets that produce life that develop civilizations, and then the fraction of civilizations that actually survive long enough so that we could communicate with them now. It might not do us any good if something evolved 1 billion years ago and they've already wiped themselves out. So scientists think really hard and this is a good intersection of astronomy with, say, sociology and culture, because forming civilizations and those civilizations surviving is not necessarily a scientific study. But so we can plug in some numbers here. So we said that planets around other stars are very common. So let's say there's billions of planets that we could look for. How many of those planets actually produce life? If we use the solar system as a guide, we have 1 out of 8 planets that currently has life. If that evidence for life on Mars is legitimate, then maybe that's 2 out of 8. So maybe you're at 12% or 25% just in the solar system. How many formed civilizations? Well, it took the Earth 4 billion years to have civilization, and can civilizations survive long term? That's something that humans are currently trying to figure out, and we're not doing a very good job of it if you think about how we're handling climate change. So this is a graph of the body mass. You can also think about that as similar to the weight of the animal compared to its brain size. And for the most part, it's a fairly linear fit, but humans are fairly, have a high brain to mass ratio, basically. But we're not such a big outlier that you could say, well, it's never going to happen again. So I think this actually shows that we're not really that much smarter than other things that could have evolved. And so we have a network called the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, that is looking for intelligent life in the universe. So they're looking for specifically radio signals that are not natural in their origin, and we send our own signals out into space and hoping that other intelligent species can detect them and maybe respond. So we sent this signal to the globular cluster M13, and because of how large space is and how long it takes for light to travel through space, maybe we'll hear back from them in 42,000 years. So we don't know how many civilizations could be out there, but using the Drake equation, you can come up with some educated guesses. And then SETI is a global network of telescopes that are looking for signals from other planets. And we'll finish today by talking about we've been very positive about there's probably life out there. All of the things we've talked about are not necessarily hard to find, but now we'll put a damper on some of our expectations a little bit. So space is just really big, and it's very hard for, at least the way humans currently know how physics works, for us to travel these kinds of distances, even to our closest stars. So our current fastest object traveling is one of the Voyager probes, and that's traveling at 1/10,000th the speed of light. So traveling at that speed, it's going to take 100,000 years to get to the nearest stars. So even if you have, like, we've talked to another civilization and gotten their radio messages, it's not really feasible with our current technology to visit them or interact with them other than through radio signals. And so some of the other things that we've put out into space, these different probes, have etchings and markings on them that if another civilization found them, they would say, oh, well, these aren't just random patterns in the rock. This is a message that some intelligent life is trying to send us. So interstellar travel is very hard. We need better technology than we currently have, and you need better protection. So our atmosphere protects us from a lot of harmful stuff out in space, but in a spaceship, you don't have that kind of protection. And there's lots of weird social implications. Let's say you travel at the speed of light to get where you're going. Because of special relativity effects, you will age a lot less than people still on Earth. So you could leave your planet, and the civilization you left behind would be completely different by the time you get to your new planet. There's also weird things like, let's say I left on a spaceship today to go colonize a different star system. In the time, and let's say current technology, it takes 100,000 years to get there. In 100,000 years, you would expect humans to have developed technology to get there a lot faster than that. So you could be the first ship to leave, and by the time you get there, several other ships have beaten you there, and they have way cooler technology than you. So it'd be like the Pilgrims were landing on Plymouth Rock, but then there were people playing like rock and roll and having electricity already in the Americas. So there's lots of weird social implications. The last thing that we'll think about is the Fermi Paradox. So you can plug in some pretty reasonable numbers into the Drake equation and get numbers like 100,000 civilizations in the galaxy. So that's a huge number, but we certainly haven't detected any of them. So the paradox is, if those plausible numbers are correct, why haven't we seen evidence of other civilizations? So some of the resolutions to that paradox are, maybe life is a lot harder to make than we think, or civilizations might be harder to make out of life. Certainly on Earth, we had billions of years of life with no civilization. Dinosaurs didn't make civilization. If there wasn't a big asteroid to wipe out the dinosaurs, Earth or humans never evolved, and so maybe there was never a civilization on the Earth. Maybe civilizations are common, but the physics of interstellar travel is just a roadblock that civilizations can never overcome. Maybe the way life evolved in other places meant exploration wasn't important, and so there was no need to colonize other star systems. Or maybe, more depressingly, civilizations do pop up all the time, but they wipe themselves out pretty quickly, which hopefully is not where humans are headed. One of the darker thoughts about the Fermi Paradox is maybe there is a galactic civilization and they're the bad guys, so everyone is really quiet so that they don't alert the bad guys to their location. But humans are currently alerting everyone to our location, so we'll leave you with just a poll. So what do you think about, are there aliens visiting the Earth? Or is there no life in the universe besides the Earth? Not necessarily a right or wrong answer, this is just for my own curiosity. Yeah, so I would say I'm personally between the yellow and the blue answers. I think there's probably life out there, maybe it's intelligent, but we haven't been visited, and we may never meet those other people. So I'll leave you with the summary of what we've talked about, and if you guys don't have any questions, then that's it for today.